My name is Serafina Whitfield. I'm 31 years old. And the night my family finally decided to say it out loud that I was a failure, they made sure there were witnesses. It happened in my parents' dining room under soft lights and expensive glassware during a celebration meant for my older brother. My mother didn't lower her voice. My father didn't stop her. My brother smiled into his drink, and his wife laughed lightly, politely, as if humiliation were just another form of small talk. They spoke about my life like it was already over, like I was something that had gone wrong and never been fixed. Then they turned their attention to my boyfriend standing quietly beside me and decided he was temporary too. That was when Paula began bragging about contracts, about a powerful healthcare platform her company had just signed, about how exclusive it was, how expensive, how important. I was staring at my plate when a man across the table went very still. He looked at me, not politely, not curiously, carefully. And then he leaned in and said, "You're the one who built that system, aren't you?" Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if stories like this resonate with you. If you're watching from somewhere in the US or beyond, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there. I truly love reading them. And to those of you who've lived long enough to be underestimated, dismissed, or quietly written off, I hope this story brings you a moment of recognition and a reminder that it's never too late to be seen. In the Whitfield household, reputation wasn't just important, it was oxygen. Everything we did, everything we said, everything we became was measured against how it would look from the outside. My father spoke often about legacy, about how a family name could open doors or close them forever. My mother curated our lives the way she curated her social calendar, trimming away anything that didn't fit the image she wanted the world to see. Success in that house had a very specific shape. And from an early age, it was clear that my brother Victor fit it perfectly. Victor was praised the way some children are groomed. His report cards were framed. His trophies were displayed at eye level. When guests came over, his achievements were recited like credentials. He learned quickly how to perform excellence, how to speak with confidence, how to agree with authority, how to win approval without friction. I watched all of this from the edges of rooms, absorbing the lesson without ever being invited into it. I wasn't jealous, not exactly. I just knew instinctively that whatever made Victor shine was not something I carried in me. What I carried instead confused them. I was the child who took things apart to see how they worked. Radios, old phones, kitchen timers. I wanted to understand the logic underneath the surface, the invisible systems holding everything together. When I was 12, I taught myself basic coding from free online forums, staying up late with a borrowed laptop, watching lines of text turn into something functional. It felt like magic to me. Creation, control, possibility. But when my parents noticed, their reaction wasn't pride, it was concern. They called it a phase, a distraction. My mother said it wasn't practical. My father said it wasn't impressive. Real success, he told me once, comes from institutions that already matter. I learned quickly that curiosity was tolerated only when it aligned with prestige. When it didn't, it became something to correct, something to smooth over, something embarrassing. So I stopped showing them what I was working on. I learned to close browser tabs when footsteps approached. I learned to nod during conversations that had nothing to do with me. The only person who ever noticed the quiet wasn't my parents. It was my grandmother, Agnes. She lived with us part of the year, moving slowly through the house with the weight of age and observation. She didn't praise loudly or interfere directly. She just paid attention. She would sit beside me while I worked, ask simple questions, listen to explanations she didn't fully understand, but respected anyway. Sometimes she would place a hand on my shoulder and say nothing at all, which somehow meant more than reassurance ever could. She never told me to be different. She never told me to fit. She just let me be. In that house, silence became my strategy, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from self-preservation. I learned that speaking invited judgment, and judgment led nowhere good. So I kept my thoughts inward. I observed, I planned, I waited. On the surface, I became agreeable, forgettable, easy to overlook. Inside, I was building something private and resilient. I didn't yet know what shape my future would take. I only knew that surviving in that family meant learning when not to speak, and trusting that one day silence would no longer be my only option. By the time we reached our late teens, the divide between Victor and me had hardened into something permanent. His path unfolded exactly as my parents had envisioned: finance credentials, proximity to power. He spoke easily about markets and strategy, about internships that led to introductions that led to offers. Every milestone he reached was celebrated as proof that the Whitfield formula worked. My parents repeated his achievements the way others repeated family lore, polishing each detail until it gleamed. I chose engineering, not as an act of rebellion, but because it was the only place my mind felt useful. I wanted to build things that solved problems, not just explain them. The work was demanding in a way that felt honest. Long hours. Failure that forced revision. Progress measured not by applause but by whether something functioned. To my parents, that distinction meant nothing. They heard technical and translated it to limited. They heard hands-on and assumed small. Praise never followed me into those conversations. Silence did. I lasted just long enough in school to understand that the institution itself was not where the learning I needed was happening. Outside the classroom, I had begun working on a project, an early attempt at a data framework that addressed inefficiencies I kept seeing ignored. It consumed me. Nights blurred into mornings. I felt awake in a way I never had before. When the opportunity came to commit to it fully, the decision wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and irreversible. Telling my family was another matter. The word they used most was waste. Waste of tuition, waste of opportunity, waste of reputation. My father spoke as if I had committed a public offense. My mother's disappointment was colder, controlled, precise, aimed at ensuring I understood exactly how far I had fallen in her estimation. Dropping out wasn't framed as a choice. It was a failure of character, a flaw, a stain. They didn't ask about the project. They didn't ask what I was building. They asked what people would say. That was the first true cut. Not because they were angry, but because they were done listening. Agnes didn't argue with them. She never did. She waited until the house settled into its familiar quiet, until judgment had exhausted itself and retreated behind closed doors. Then she came to my room with an envelope and a look that told me she had already decided something important. Inside was cash. Not a gift, not charity, a bridge. She told me Denver would give me space. She told me distance could be useful. She didn't tell me to call home. She didn't tell me to apologize. She told me to take care of myself. Leaving felt less like departure and more like exile. I packed light because I had learned not to expect permanence. I carried the weight of what I was giving up more than what I was taking with me. There was no dramatic farewell, no last argument. Just an understanding, unspoken but final, that I was stepping outside the version of family they were willing to support. On the plane, I felt something loosen. Fear, yes, but also relief. I had stopped trying to translate myself into a language they respected. I had accepted that choosing my own path might mean losing them, at least for a while. That acceptance hurt, but it also clarified everything. I wasn't leaving to prove them wrong. I was leaving to remain intact, to keep the part of me that worked, that questioned, that built. If the cost of that was distance, then distance would have to be enough. Denver didn't greet me with anything dramatic. No revelation, no sense of arrival. Just a narrow rented apartment with thin walls and a heater that clicked all night, reminding me that comfort was conditional now. The space was barely large enough for a bed, a folding table, and the secondhand desk I'd found online. It wasn't the kind of place you imagined a future in. It was the kind of place you survived from quietly, without witnesses. I took a job at a mid-sized healthcare technology company because it was the first place that didn't ask where I'd gone to school before asking what I could actually do. The pay was modest, the title forgettable, but the systems were complex, and that was enough to keep me there. Every day, I sat in front of dashboards filled with patient data, insurance codes, and fragmented records that barely spoke to one another. Everyone accepted the inefficiency as normal. I didn't. The gaps bothered me. The workarounds. The quiet assumption that this is just how it works. It was there that I met Elliot. He sat 2 desks away, usually with headphones on, typing in long stretches without interruption. He didn't talk much in meetings. He listened. When he did speak, it was always after he'd thought something through. We started collaborating by accident, an overlapping task, a shared deadline. He didn't ask me where I came from. He didn't ask why I hadn't finished my degree. He asked how I thought something should be structured. It was a small thing, but it disarmed me completely. Our conversations stayed technical at first: code reviews, architecture debates, whiteboard diagrams that spilled over into lunch breaks. Elliot had a calm way of challenging ideas without turning them into contests. When something didn't work, he didn't assign blame. He adjusted the model. That approach, quiet, iterative, grounded, felt unfamiliar and safe. Over time, our collaboration became routine, then friendship, then something steadier, built not on performance, but on mutual respect. The longer I worked there, the more the underlying problem revealed itself. The healthcare data systems weren't just inefficient, they were fundamentally misaligned. Different platforms stored the same information in incompatible formats, forcing hospitals to rely on manual reconciliation. Errors slipped through constantly. Delays compounded. Everyone treated it as an inconvenience. I started seeing it as a structural failure. At night, back in my apartment, I sketched. Not business plans, not pitches, just diagrams, translation layers, data normalization pathways, a way for systems to speak without being rebuilt from scratch. The idea wasn't elegant yet. It was rough, unproven, full of assumptions, but it made sense to me in a way nothing had since I left home. I could see how it might work. I could also see how disruptive it would be if it did. I didn't tell my family. I didn't even tell most of my coworkers. The idea felt too fragile to expose to doubt. Elliot was the exception. One night, after the office had emptied out, I showed him my notes. He didn't react with enthusiasm or skepticism. He studied them, asked questions. Then he nodded slowly. "This could fix a lot of things," he said. "Not change the world? Not make money. Just fix something broken." That was enough. For the first time since leaving, I felt the loneliness shift into focus. I was still on my own, but I was no longer wandering. I had a problem worth solving, and a mind that knew how to approach it. The apartment was still small, the future still uncertain, but something had begun to take shape. Quietly, deliberately, on my terms. What began as sketches on scrap paper slowly turned into something more deliberate. Elliot and I started staying late after work, waiting until the office lights dimmed and the noise of the day receded. At first, it was just experimentation, testing assumptions, writing fragments of code that would never make it into production. But as the pieces began to align, the nights grew longer. We worked in quiet stretches, fueled by cheap coffee and the shared understanding that whatever we were building needed to stay invisible for now. My apartment became a second workspace. The folding table held 2 laptops, a mess of cables and notebooks filled with crossed-out ideas. We spoke in shorthand, communicating through diagrams and half-finished sentences. There was no grand vision statement, No talk of disruption or scale. Just a focus on solving the problem cleanly in a way that wouldn't break under pressure. That restraint mattered. I had seen too many projects collapse under the weight of premature ambition. The turning point came unexpectedly. A mutual contact of Elliot's mentioned our prototype to someone he trusted, careful not to name us directly. That someone was Leonard Shaw. He didn't arrive with fanfare. He didn't ask for a pitch deck. He asked for a demonstration. We met him in a borrowed conference room after hours, the kind with generic art and stale air. I walked him through the system, slowly explaining not just what it did, but why it had been built that way. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back and said only one thing: "You've built the right foundation." A week later, he offered to fund us. A modest amount by industry standards, but enough to give us breathing room. Enough to make the work real. I accepted on one condition: that my name not be used. Not publicly, not in filings, not in introductions. Leonard raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He asked why. I told him the truth, though I didn't name my family. I told him I had learned what happened when people decided who you were before you had finished becoming yourself. From that moment on, everything we built carried a layer of intentional distance. I didn't use my full name on documents. I avoided conferences. I stayed off panels. Elliot became the visible point of contact when necessary, and even that was minimal. It wasn't about ego. It was about protection. I had spent too long being underestimated to risk having something fragile pulled apart by people who didn't understand it, or worse, claimed ownership once it succeeded. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was overreacting, if the fear was outdated. But then I would remember how easily my family had dismissed my work before it existed, how quickly they had rewritten my choices into cautionary tales. I couldn't let that narrative touch this. Not yet. This wasn't rebellion. It was preservation. We incorporated quietly, hired slowly, tested relentlessly. The system improved with each iteration, becoming more stable, more adaptable. Hospitals began using it in limited capacities, then expanding. Each success came without applause. No announcements, no celebrations. Just quiet confirmation that the work held up. Through it all, Elliot never pushed me to step forward. He understood the weight of what I was guarding. When doubts crept in, he reminded me that anonymity didn't diminish ownership, that building something real didn't require being seen by everyone, only by the people who mattered. I knew I couldn't hide forever. But for now, the shadows felt necessary. They gave me space to build without interference, without expectation, without my past reaching in to claim a future it hadn't helped create. Whatever this company became, it would be mine, because I had protected it when it was most vulnerable. And I was willing to carry the loneliness of that choice for as long as it took. Success didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, contract by contract, hospital by hospital. The first agreements were small pilot programs, limited integrations designed to test whether the system could withstand real-world complexity. It did. Then came expansions, renewals. Referrals passed discreetly between administrators who cared less about branding and more about results. Our platform slipped into places that mattered without ever announcing itself. That anonymity suited me. It allowed the work to speak in its own language, measured in reduced errors and smoother coordination, not headlines. As the company stabilized, my life changed in ways that felt almost unreal. Bills stopped being a source of anxiety. The apartment no longer felt temporary. I could afford to pause without everything collapsing. Financial freedom arrived without ceremony, and I didn't know what to do with it at first. I kept living the same way, wearing the same clothes, riding the same transit routes. Part of me didn't trust the shift. Part of me was still bracing for it to be taken away. Agnes was the first person I told. It happened during one of her visits when she sat at my small kitchen table, hands folded around a mug of tea. She had aged more noticeably since I'd last seen her, moving slower, watching more. I didn't plan a reveal. I simply answered her question honestly when she asked how work was going. I showed her the interface. I explained what the system did, how it helped hospitals avoid mistakes. She listened, eyes intent, as if every word mattered. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't ask how much it was worth. She said, "You did this the right way." Then she looked at me carefully and added, "Don't tell them yet." I didn't ask who she meant. She squeezed my fingers gently. "Tell them only when you're safe." Agnes understood something my parents never had. That safety wasn't just financial, it was emotional, structural. Once my family knew, they wouldn't simply react, they would reposition themselves. They would reinterpret the past to fit the present. They would decide what this success meant and who it belonged to. Agnes had lived long enough to recognize that pattern. Her silence wasn't avoidance, it was strategy. I kept the secret. The company grew. Our team expanded. I remained in the background, shaping architecture, setting direction, letting others carry titles. There were moments when that invisibility felt heavy, when recognition would have been validating, when I wondered if I was hiding out of habit rather than necessity. But then I would remember the conversations I'd had growing up, the dismissals, the corrections, the quiet erasure. I wasn't ready to hand my work over to those dynamics. Financial independence brought clarity, but it didn't bring closure. I could support myself, support the company, support Agnes when she needed it. Yet I remained unknown in the one place that had shaped me most. My family still spoke of me as if I were drifting, still offered advice that assumed struggle, still framed my choices as temporary deviations. I let them. Correcting them would have meant opening doors I wasn't prepared to walk through. At night, I sometimes sat with the contradiction. I had built something substantial, something that worked, something that mattered. And yet, I moved through the world as if it didn't exist. The success was real. The recognition wasn't. That absence stung in ways I didn't expect. Not because I wanted praise, but because being unseen by the people who raised you leaves a particular kind of echo. Agnes never pushed me. She never suggested I step forward. She trusted my timing. Her belief was steady, unspoken enough. Knowing that someone saw the whole of me, past, present, and future, made the waiting bearable. When the moment came, I would speak. Until then, the silence remained a form of protection. One I had learned to carry with care. The invitation arrived with more weight than warmth. Heavy cardstock, formal language, a date circled weeks in advance. My parents were hosting a large family gathering celebrating Victor's latest promotion and the purchase of a new home. The message was clear even before I read between the lines. This was a showcase, an audience, a moment designed to be seen. My name was added almost as an afterthought, tucked into a sentence about family coming together. I hesitated longer than I expected. Not because I feared seeing them, but because I knew exactly what kind of night it would be. Victor and Paula treated the event like a victory lap. From the moment we arrived, they moved through the house, greeting guests with rehearsed ease, recounting timelines and titles, pointing out renovations as if narrating a guided tour. Their laughter carried easily. Their confidence filled the room. I watched from the side, hand resting lightly against Elliot's arm, feeling the familiar sensation of being slightly out of frame. Elliot didn't belong to their world, and they made sure everyone noticed. Paula introduced him with a thin smile, lingering just long enough on his job description to reduce it to something small. Victor asked questions that sounded polite but landed like tests. Where did he work? Who did he work for? How long had he been there? Elliot answered calmly without embellishment. That restraint seemed to irritate them more than insecurity ever would have. When he excused himself to get a drink, I heard Paula murmur something about temporary arrangements, followed by soft laughter. My parents didn't bother hiding their disappointment. My mother commented on my appearance too simple, too understated, as if subtlety were a personal affront. My father asked for the third time that evening whether I had settled into something more stable yet. Each remark was framed as concern. Each one carried an edge. I responded the way I always had, briefly, politely, without resistance. I could feel the pressure building, the unspoken expectation that I would either justify myself or fade into the background. They were comfortable either way. As the night went on, the room grew louder, but the air felt heavier. Conversations overlapped. Glasses clinked. Compliments flowed toward Victor and Paula in steady waves. I became a convenient contrast, a reminder of what not to be. My parents leaned into it, offering small anecdotes about my wandering phase, about how I was still figuring things out. They spoke as if I weren't standing there, as if my life were a rumor they were correcting in real time. Elliot noticed. I could tell by the way his posture shifted, by how his hand tightened briefly around his glass. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend me. He trusted me to handle it or to choose not to. That trust steadied me more than anything my family could have offered. The tension peaked when Paula raised her voice just enough for nearby guests to hear, making a comment about ambition and knowing your place. Victor laughed. My parents didn't correct her. They smiled the way people do when a truth they believe has been spoken aloud by someone else. The room felt suddenly smaller, hotter. Every word pressed in. I realized then that this wasn't just a celebration. It was a trap. An environment carefully constructed to reinforce a hierarchy that had never changed. They hadn't invited me to reconnect. They had invited me to witness my own marginalization again. The old instinct to retreat surfaced sharp and familiar. But something else rose with it. Not anger, not defiance, just clarity. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to escape. I only needed to stay long enough to see the pattern one last time. The air was thick with expectation, and I could feel it straining on the verge of breaking. The shift happened subtly, the way storms do when no one is watching the horizon. Paula was in the middle of a story, one she clearly enjoyed telling, about a major contract her firm had just secured. She spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to admiration, punctuating details with practiced pauses. A next-generation healthcare platform, a multi-year agreement, significant savings, industry recognition. Heads nodded around the room. Glasses were lifted. Victor beamed beside her, basking in borrowed prestige. I wasn't listening at first. I had learned long ago how to let those moments pass without leaving a mark. But then she mentioned a feature. Just one. A data translation layer that eliminated manual reconciliation between systems. My attention snapped into place. She continued, unaware, describing the architecture in broad strokes, how it allowed legacy platforms to communicate without modification. My chest tightened. The words were familiar in a way that had nothing to do with coincidence. I looked up. The phrasing wasn't exact, but the logic was unmistakable. The solution, the structure, the way she framed the problem. I had written that. Not the marketing version, but the core, the thing underneath the language. For a moment, I wondered if I was projecting, if years of living inside the system had made me see it everywhere. Then she named the implementation timeline, the rollout sequence, details that weren't public. Across the table, Dr. Samuel Klein had gone still. He was a late arrival, introduced earlier as a guest from a partnering hospital. Quiet, observant. He hadn't spoken much all evening. Now he was looking directly at me, his expression unreadable. Paula continued riding the momentum of the room, gesturing lightly as if she had personally overseen the innovation. Dr. Klein didn't wait for her to finish. That platform, he said calmly, cutting through the chatter, is one of the most effective systems we've deployed in the last decade. The room quieted out of reflex. It's been transformative for our data flow, he continued. Reduced errors, improved response times. Frankly, it's changed how we operate. He paused, then turned fully toward me. I've met the architect behind it. The word landed heavier than it should have. Paula laughed, assuming a compliment was coming her way. Victor leaned forward, curious. My parents exchanged a look, confusion flickering across their faces. Dr. Klein didn't smile. He studied me for a beat longer, then said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "You built it, didn't you?" The air left the room. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just a collective intake of breath that never quite found its release. Paula's smile faltered. Victor's brows knit together. My mother's hand froze mid-gesture. My father straightened in his chair as if recalibrating his posture to match a new reality. I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't savoring the moment. I was registering it. The convergence of timelines. The inevitability of exposure. This was the risk Agnes had warned me about, not malice, not confrontation, but collision. The truth meeting a narrative that had been carefully maintained for years. Dr. Klein didn't press. He didn't need to. The recognition in his eyes was confirmation enough. Around us, whispers began. Questions formed without being asked. Paula's voice returned thinner now, attempting to steer the conversation elsewhere. Victor cleared his throat. My parents looked at me not with concern but calculation. I felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next, the illusion had cracked. The story they had been telling about me quietly, persistently, was no longer holding its shape. And for the first time that evening, the room wasn't suffocating. It was suspended. Waiting. Someone said the word before I did. Not loudly, not dramatically. It slipped into the space between breaths, carried on the certainty of recognition rather than accusation. Founder. It came from a woman near the end of the table, someone I didn't know, someone who had been listening more than speaking all night. She wasn't looking at Paula. She was looking at me. The room turned in increments, attention shifting like a slow tide. I felt Elliot's shoulder steady beside mine. I didn't look at him yet. "Yes," I said. My voice surprised even me. Calm, unadorned. Not defensive, not triumphant. Just accurate. "I am." There was no immediate reaction, which somehow made it heavier. My mother's face drained of color, her expression caught between disbelief and the reflex to correct a mistake. My father didn't speak at all. He stared at me as if I had stepped out of alignment with a story he had rehearsed for years. The silence stretched long enough for the implication to settle, long enough for the room to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. Victor looked down at his glass. He didn't lift it. He didn't drink. His jaw tightened the way it used to when he was younger and couldn't find the right response quickly enough. The confidence he had worn so easily all evening slipped, replaced by something brittle and exposed. He glanced at Paula, then away again. Paula was unraveling. At first she laughed too quickly, too brightly, insisting there must be some confusion. Then her eyes darted toward Dr. Klein, searching for reassurance that didn't come. Her posture changed. Shoulders stiffened. Words came out in fragments, explanations layered over one another until none of them held. The platform, the contract, the timing. She tried to regain control by speaking faster, louder, as if volume could restore the hierarchy she'd relied on minutes earlier. It didn't. Questions surfaced. Quiet ones. Curious ones. Someone asked about implementation. Someone else mentioned outcomes. I answered when it made sense to answer. I declined when it didn't. There was no announcement, no summary. Just clarity. The truth didn't need embellishment. My parents remained still, absorbing the shift. My mother's gaze moved between my face and the people now regarding me with interest rather than pity. My father leaned back, recalculating, his expression unreadable. I recognized it. The look he used when a case changed direction unexpectedly. When the facts no longer supported the argument he had prepared. Elliot stepped forward slightly, not to speak, but to exist in the space with me. I noticed the way people began to look at him differently, not as an accessory, not as a temporary presence, but as someone connected to something real. The dismissal fell away without ceremony. Respect replaced it quietly, without apology. I felt no rush of vindication, no desire to explain myself further. The need to prove anything had evaporated the moment I spoke the truth and watched it stand on its own. This wasn't a reveal I had orchestrated. It wasn't a performance. It was a correction, and corrections don't require justification. As the room adjusted, I stayed where I was, grounded, present. The years of silence hadn't weakened me, they had prepared me for this exact stillness. I understood then that recognition, when it comes, doesn't heal old wounds. It simply removes the pressure to keep pretending they don't exist. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their understanding. The story had shifted not because I demanded it, but because reality had arrived on its own terms. And for the first time, that was enough. The aftermath didn't explode the way people imagine moments like that should. It settled instead, heavy, deliberate, unavoidable. Conversations resumed in fragments. Guests spoke more carefully now, as if adjusting their footing on unfamiliar ground. My parents were the first to move. My father approached with a measured expression, the kind he used when shifting from judgment to negotiation. His voice softened. He spoke about connections, about opportunities, about how proud he was now that I had built something so substantial. My mother followed her tone warmer than it had been all evening, her questions suddenly detailed. How long had I been working on it? How many hospitals was I planning to expand? Each inquiry carried an unspoken subtext: we belong in this story too. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I recognized the pivot for what it was: not reconciliation, but realignment. They weren't apologizing for the years of dismissal. They were trying to reposition themselves next to success now that it had become visible. I felt no anger, just clarity. Before I could respond, Agnes spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with the authority of someone who had outlived pretenses. She stepped forward, slowly resting a hand on the back of my chair. "You don't get to claim this," she said calmly, looking at my parents. "Not now. Not after all this time." The room stilled again. She didn't accuse. She stated facts. She spoke of nights spent doubting, of choices made without support, of a granddaughter who had learned to survive without approval. "She built this without you," Agnes finished. "That matters." There was nothing to add after that. I thanked my parents for coming, for hosting, for caring in their own way. I declined their offers carefully, clearly. I wasn't interested in partnerships. I wasn't interested in leveraging family connections. My work didn't need mediation. My life didn't need correction. The boundary wasn't dramatic. It was final. Victor didn't say much. He nodded once, eyes downcast, shame and relief tangled together. Paula avoided my gaze entirely. Whatever narrative she had planned for the evening had collapsed, and she didn't yet know how to rebuild it. Elliot and I left without ceremony. No speeches, no lingering. Just a quiet exit into the night air. Outside, the tension drained from my shoulders as if I had been holding it for decades. The city felt unchanged, the world intact. We walked side by side in silence for a while, our steps unhurried. I realized then that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of alignment. I didn't need closure from my family. I didn't need validation rewritten after the fact. I needed space to live honestly without shrinking or performing or defending. Choosing peace meant letting go of the idea that reconciliation had to look a certain way. It meant accepting that some relationships would remain incomplete, and that was survivable. Preferable, even. I had spent years building systems that functioned by respecting boundaries. It made sense to apply the same principle to my own life. As we reached the car, I looked back once, not at the house, but at the distance I had created. It wasn't cold, It wasn't cruel, it was necessary. And for the first time, it felt like enough. There is a lesson I didn't understand for a long time, even after everything I built began to stand on its own. It isn't about success or money or proving anyone wrong. It's about permission, the quiet kind. The kind you give yourself when no one else does. For years, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I built something undeniable, the people who doubted me would finally see me clearly. What I learned instead is that clarity doesn't always arrive with recognition. Sometimes it arrives with distance, with the realization that you don't need everyone's approval to live honestly. That being misunderstood is painful, but being untrue to yourself costs far more. Letting go of the need to be validated didn't make me cold. It made me steady. It allowed me to choose peace without rewriting the past or forcing forgiveness that hadn't earned its place. Some relationships heal slowly, some don't. And that doesn't mean you failed. It just means you learned where your responsibility ends. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose yourself even when it was misunderstood? And if you found value here, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps more stories like this find the people who might need them.